Greetings, genealogists. This is Kay Rudolph. Welcome to the third and penultimate episode based on a love story proved, the life and family of Laura Lavinia Kelley Combs of Atlanta and Augusta, Georgia. Research by Paul K. Graham, which he published in the National Genealogical Society Journal in 2013. In part one of this series, we examined the origins of a legend that the first person of color to own property in Atlanta, Georgia, sold that property to buy her husband's freedom. And in that we saw how Paul Graham had proved that the earlier research that had been conducted on that legend had been incorrect. In part two, we identified the most likely real free woman of color who owned the property that was the basis of the legend published in Carter's 1894 History of Atlanta. And our next challenge here in part three is going to be to prove the truth behind the legend that Laura Combs sold her property to purchase her husband's freedom. First thing we want to do when we sit down to work on a genealogical problem is we want to assess what we know. We know here that Laura Combs was a free woman of color and she owned property at Wheat and Pryor Streets in Atlanta in 1854. Pryor Street extends north to become Peachtree Street, which is what Carter recorded in 1894 as the origins of the legend. So we have Laura living on that property in 1854 as the owner. In 1859, we find a Jane and Mary Combs residing on that property, and in 1860, Jane Combs was recorded as the legal owner of that property. And in 1885, her heirs sold that lot to the YMCA. The following year, in 1886, a person named Oswald A. Combs signed a quitclaim deed to that property. Thinking through what we know, we want to understand what was the connection between Laura Combs and Jane and Mary Combs. We want to understand who this Oswald A. Combs was and how he was connected to any of these people. And why did he need to sign a quitclaim deed after the sale of Jane's property? So we're going to prepare our plan D for our research into this legend. But to prepare to do so, we're going to need to make sure that we understand the background of the location that we are researching. So we're going to check for any jurisdiction changes, that is, any county boundary changes that might indicate where we would find records. We're going to look at the Family Search Wiki articles to see what they suggest for collections that are relevant for tracking free persons of color in Atlanta. And we're going to talk to local experts who might know of unique collections that don't appear online. Perhaps they're not widely available. So don't forget to check real people. And so we're going to look at how we would go about identifying some of these real people. The first step, identifying jurisdictions. There is a terrific tool out there, an add-on to Google Earth, that is the Newberry Atlas of Historical County Boundaries. And I've talked about this at more length in the Google Earth for Genealogists session. So this is an add-on that allows us to overlay historical county boundaries and cycle through them using this timeline. So we see here is Atlanta in 1822. It is in Fayette County. In 1824, county lines have been redrawn and Atlanta is now part of DeKalb County. And it remains part of DeKalb until 1855 when the county boundaries again shift and now it is part of Fulton County. Going to the Family Search Wiki, we're going to check the articles on DeKalb County. We want to understand the history of DeKalb County, what the record availability is, what the history of record loss is, and we'll do likewise for Fulton County. Also note that there are additional articles providing information about records especially pertinent to African American researchers. We'll want to take a look at those. Looking through the article on DeKalb County, there is this section here that provides information on websites and references. For example, note the DeKalb History Center. They may have suggestions on materials not mentioned in the wiki, so we'll want to check out their webpage and perhaps call their research librarian. The article on Fulton County includes a list of historical societies with their web pages and contact information. We're going to want to check them out and see what suggestions they might have to help our research. Having gone through the articles and having spoken with the specialists on those locations, we've come up with 4 primary databases that we're going to want to search for records on Laura Combs. The Freedman Savings and Trust Company records, census records 1850 and 1860, the Register of Free Persons of Color for Atlanta, and the Georgia Property Tax Digests. So going first to the Family Search Wiki, pulling up the collection for the United States Freedmen's Bank records 1865 to 1874, I'm doing a simple search for Laura Combs, no additional search terms. I can always add those later if I get too many results. I want to make sure that I'm not restricting my search too quickly at the beginning. And I come up with 18 possible results. Start looking through these. And I have here the record for Laura Lavinia Combs. And in this, she lists where she was brought up, where she's living, her age. There is a tremendous amount of information. There's too much information to just process by looking at it. You really need to go to the next step and create a transcription of that record. So we can see here, she was born in Augusta, Georgia. She was brought up in Augusta and lived for 8 months in Atlanta. She is residing on Butler near the Culvert. In 1870, she is age 46. That gives us an estimate for her year of birth. Complexion black, occupation laundress. It names her husband, John Combs. It names her children and their ages. Thomas Simmons, 31, and their current location in New Orleans. John Simmons, 28, in Columbus, Mississippi. Jane Combs, 16, in New Orleans. Cornelia, 14, Laura Ann, 10, Oswell, 9, and Jacob, 3, all in Atlanta. They don't have surnames, so one assumes that their surname is Combs. She also notes that she has 3 children who are dead. Her father's name is included, Jacob Ross, where and when he died about 4 years ago in Augusta. Her mother's name, Judy, where she is residing. The names of her brothers, James, who is in Augusta, William and Madison and Augustus are dead, and sisters, Emily in Augusta and Anne, dead. So a huge amount of genealogical information. While we're looking at the Freedmen's Bank records, let's take a look for other Combs living in Georgia. I have left the name Combs without a check mark here, so I'm going to get anything that's a variation of it, similar to it. That would include the C-O-O-M-B-S spelling, for example. But I have put a check mark limiting that I need to have Georgia mentioned somewhere as a place name in the record. We have 7 search results. Here is Laura Lavinia Combs, but note we have 3 mentioning her son Oswell. Here we have one record for Oswell dated October 12, 1870, noting that he was brought up in Augusta and Atlanta, residing on Butler Street. That matches the information we have from Laura Lavinia Combs' record earlier that year. He's age 9, brown complexion. His father is John. His mother is Laura, but note his brothers' names, Thomas Kelley and John Greenfield, as well as James Combs, Cornelia and Laura, his sister. So we need to add these names Kelley and Greenfield to the list of possible surnames for Laura, as well as that surname Ross, which Laura had listed as being her father's name. In this record from December of 1872, Oswell lists his father John, his mother Laura L., and his mother is now listed as deceased. And while we're on Oswell, that's an unusual name, so I really like to follow up on unusual names because they can sometimes be very productive. So I do a straightforward Google search. I'm going to put in quotation marks Oswell asterisk Combs. That is going to search for a sequence of words. The word Oswell with any number of words followed by the word Combs. I've also put Atlanta in quotation marks, indicating that I require the word Atlanta to be part of any search result page. Now, my first hope is that we'll find that somebody has already done the research on this family and posted the family tree with all the information we could hope for. I don't find that, but I do find some very interesting entries here about an Oswell Augustus Combs living in Atlanta at the turn of the 19th century. Let's see what we can find in a search for this Oswell Augustus Combs. So you do, again, a restricted search, putting the term Oswell Augustus Combs in quotation marks, restricting only search results that have that entire phrase in that order. Scanning down the search results, one particularly catches my eye. That is the full text of History of the American Negro and His Institutions. It promises to have more information about Oswell, possibly even a biography. Now, this is the History of the American Negro and His Institutions, the Georgia edition. So I'm going to keep this resource in mind for other research that I might be doing on African American family history. There are likely Alabama editions, Virginia editions. So this is a resource that I'm going to bookmark and keep for future reference. It does indeed have a biography of Oswell Augustus Combs. Note here, he was born in Augusta on June 5th, 1861, and is a son of John Combs, who was a slave and a barber by trade. His mother's maiden name was Laura L. Benefield, who was freeborn. That all ties in with the information that we have collected about Laura, and it confirms that John Combs, Laura's husband, was a slave. It's also given us some additional surnames that we're going to need to search. In addition to the Combs, Kelley, and Ross, and Simmons, we're going to want to research that name Benefield. I assume that that entry of Greenfield was a miswriting of the word Benefield. Now, let's go back to Laura. We had already found her in the 1850 census. She was living on her own, calling herself Laura Combs. So she is already using the Combs surname, but we don't see any of her children. We don't see her husband. In 1860, we don't find her under Combs, but we find her using the surname Kelley. We did a search for Laura Kelley, restricting it to Georgia. We have the return here. We have Laura, she's working as a laundress. Her age in 1860 is 35. This ties in well with the age of 46 listed on the 1870 bank record. It contradicts the 1850 census that listed her age as 30. So I'm inclined to think that she really was born in the sort of 1824, 1825, based on this 1860 and the 1870 report. I can think of a number of reasons why the 1850 report could include an incorrect age. It might have been that she was trying to appear older than she was, or it might be that somebody else had provided that information. Her children, James, Cornelia, and Laura, match the information we have from the Freedman Bank's record. There is also a woman, Betsy, age 75, from South Carolina, living in the household. That's a new name for us. Note that she has 0 real estate here and $100 of personal estate. Now, these large values for personal estate that you see up here, those are likely slaves. The next collection that we wanted to look at is the DeKalb County Registry of Free Persons of Color. This is available on Ancestry.com. Laura appears in the register for Atlanta in August of 1851, in June of 1853, and then again in October of 1853. The next set of collections that we wanted to find were Georgia property tax records. And in Ancestry, we access that by going to the search button, selecting the option for card catalog, and then filtering through, selecting North America, United States, Georgia, restricting it only to wills, probates, land, tax, and criminal records, and finally to tax lists. You can sort these by popularity, and I usually prefer to sort them by number of records, because frequently the most popular collections are not always the largest collections. So here we have Georgia Property Tax Digests. We'll open that up, and we're going to do a search for Laura and her various surnames: Kelley, Combs, Benefield, Simmons, Ross. We find her using the surname Kelley. I have restricted the first name to Laura and any similar sounding or spelled names, and Kelley likewise restricted to any similarly sounding or spelled names. Those are the only restrictions I've given, no other restrictions by place, and get 5 results. Now, the one for Larry Killow, I think that we're going to bypass that, but certainly these 4 for Atlanta and Augusta fit the profile that we have for Laura. Here we are looking at the 1855 list for Atlanta. Let's take a closer look at these column headings. Poles, professions, dentists, daguerrean artists, Negroes who were nominally slaves, free persons of color, and slaves permitted to hire their time. Poor school children. Then we have the real estate section, number of acres, quality of acres, county where the land is in use, aggregate value, value of city or town property, slave ownership, merchandise, and so forth, aggregate value of whole property, and then over here, the amount of tax on professions, dentists, poles, free persons of color, etc. The amount assessed at 1%, this would be the land tax, and the total tax paid. So let's take a look at the tax that our Laura paid. Laura's entry reads guardian for Laura Kelley, and her tick mark 1 is in the column free persons of color. So we have Alexander James F., who is a guardian for various individuals. In 2 cases, they are free persons of color. Looking at the rest of Laura's entry, we can see her aggregate value of city or town property is $1,000. So in 1855, Laura owned a piece of property valued at $1,000. Here we see that she paid $5 tax for being a free person of color. Compare that to the amount she was assessed on that $1,000 lot. She paid 72 cents in property tax. So that gives you some sense of this extremely large tax that was placed on individuals who are free persons of color living in southern states at that time. The results for 1862, 63, and 64 tax Laura as a free person of color. Note above, there is also an Eliza Ann Kelley recorded as a free person of color and a Leah Kent. However, there is no property listed by her name, and she is only taxed the $7.54 that other free persons of color are taxed. I was a little concerned about how difficult some of that handwriting was to read, so I did a search for Laura, leaving the last name blank, and I've set the flexibility for the first name for exact, sounds like, and similar. And I've chosen a time span of 1860 plus or minus 10 years, restricting it to Richmond County, Georgia. This brought up a result for a Laura Keller for Richmond for 1861, which would fill in that period nicely. Taking a closer look, here we have the Eliza Kelley that we had previously, and this is clearly Laura Kelley. Again, she is just taxed as a free person of color with no land. But why are we only finding 5 tax records for Laura, the 1855 and the 1861, 62, 63, and 64? Part of it has to do with the records that have survived to the present day. When we look at the list of available tax rolls for Richmond, you can see that there are a number of years that are missing. We might want to take a look through some of these earlier records, though, to see if we can find Laura in them, perhaps misindexed. And I looked at the 1858 list. I find the Kelleys here. I find a Paul, a Martha, a widow, a Mary, and a Margaret. Now, this group of women here are free women of color. It's possible that Laura is one of them using a different name. I would need to research all of these individuals to verify that they are uniquely different and cannot be Laura. What about for Fulton County? There are also a number of years that are missing there. We have the 1855, which is the first year in which the county existed, and that is where we found Laura taxed for $1,000 worth of city property. I checked her in the 1856. Again, remember that in 1855, she was taxed, but her record was indexed under that of her guardian, James Alexander. I looked here in 1856 and did not find her associated with him. It's possible that she may have changed her guardian. So I went through and I did a page-by-page search looking at this column, Free Persons of Color, and I did not find anyone in Atlanta in 1856 that could be our Laura. So we could continue to do some digging into this, looking at the other tax years and studying these other families. But I think at this point we have enough for our purpose at hand, which is to understand this legend about a woman who sold her property to purchase her husband's freedom. So we've gathered a tremendous amount of information. We need to put this into some format so we can get an understanding of what it is that we know about Laura's life so far. I like using timelines because that puts a person's life into a sort of order that I can understand. We have the 1870 bank record and the 1860 census agree that Laura was born in about 1824, 1825. That 1850 census that lists her at 30 years old doesn't fit with these other records that we have for her. And I can understand how a census at that period could be incorrect. We don't know who provided the information. The fact that her age was listed as a round number like 30 or 35, that's fairly typical when somebody is just estimating somebody else's age. So I'm comfortable with holding to this 1824 to 1825 as being the likely period when she was born. Her first son that we're aware of, Thomas Simmons, was born in 1839 when she would have been 14 or 15 years old. And her second son was born 3 years later, John Simmons. In 1850, Laura was using the name Combs already, and she was living alone. Where are these two older children? Well, it's possible they are living back in Augusta with her mother. We haven't explored that area of the family because our focus right now is on this question about her ownership of the property and did she sell that property to purchase her husband's freedom. And I got to tell you, I'm very tempted to go running off chasing that rabbit, but you've got to resist that and you got to stay focused on your original question. So continuing on with Laura's life. In 1851 and 1853, she was living in Atlanta, registered in the Free Person of Color Registry. She was still living in Atlanta in 1854 when she was named in an Atlanta deed as a landowner. In 1854, her son James was born, and this is the first child who goes by the surname Combs, the first living child. We note that in the 1870 bank record, she did note that she had had 3 children who are now deceased or were deceased in 1870. In 1855, Laura, using the name Kelley, was taxed on $1,000 worth of land. She had a guardian, James Alexander. She was still living in Atlanta. In 1856, her daughter Cornelia Combs was born. 1860, her daughter Laura Ann. In 1860, she was enumerated in Augusta, Georgia now. And here in the enumeration, she used the surname Kelley. In 1861, her son Oswell was born. In 1861 through 1864, she appears in the Richmond County tax digests, taxed as a free person of color, but not taxed on owning any land. In 1867, her son Jacob was born, and we have that 1870 record where she lists that she's residing in Atlanta, that her husband's name is John Combs, and she was deceased by 1872 when Oswell's bank record lists her as dead. In 1886, we have Oswell quitclaiming his interest in that property on Wheat Street and Pryor Street. So there are a number of questions that come up here. Why is she using 2 different surnames in that period? Why does she have a guardian in 1855? Why did her son sign a quitclaim deed on the property at Wheat and Pryor in 1886 after Jane Combs had sold the lot to the YMCA, when we have Jane Combs recognized as being the legal owner back in 1860? And what does all of this have to do with Laura's husband, John Combs? We do know from Oswell's biography that John was a slave, but we haven't found any documentation about Laura selling her property and purchasing John's freedom. Why is that? Well, that will come in the ultimate section that we're going to cover next. The laws that Laura lived under explain many of the questions that we have about her life. See you then. Thank you.